The December evening air carried the promise of snow as my carriage wheels crunched over the frost-covered gravel leading to Thornfield Manor. I am Garrett Blackwood, Duke of Ravenhall, 28 years of age, and I had attended countless such gatherings throughout my life. Yet something felt different about this particular Christmas ball. Perhaps it was the weight of the debts my late father had left behind, or the mounting pressure from my mother to secure a financially advantageous marriage. Whatever the reason, I found myself reluctant to step into that glittering world of false smiles and calculated conversations. The massive oak doors of Thornfield Manor swung open before me, revealing a scene that took my breath away despite my reluctance. Hundreds of candles flickered from crystal chandeliers, casting golden light across the marble floors where ladies in silk gowns of every imaginable color swirled like exotic butterflies. The scent of mulled wine mingled with pine garlands and the delicate perfumes of the assembled nobility. A string quartet played from the corner, their melodies weaving through the gentle hum of conversation and laughter. I straightened my shoulders and adjusted my formal coat, reminding myself of the role I must play. The Duke of Ravenhall commanded respect, regardless of the financial difficulties that kept me awake at night. My dark hair was perfectly styled, my gray eyes betrayed nothing of my inner turmoil, and my tailored evening wear spoke of wealth and position. No one here needed to know that beneath this polished exterior lay a man drowning in his family's accumulated debts. Lord Pemberton himself greeted me near the entrance, his weathered face breaking into what I knew was a forced smile. Our families had maintained a bitter feud for decades, stemming from disputed land rights that had cost both sides considerable fortune and pride. Yet social conventions demanded we maintain civility in public. He extended his hand, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a seasoned politician. "Your Grace, what an honor to have you join us this evening." I clasped his hand firmly, meeting his gaze with equal measure of false cordiality. "Lord Pemberton, thank you for the invitation. Thornfield Manor has never looked more magnificent." We exchanged the expected pleasantries while I surveyed the crowd, noting familiar faces and calculating which conversations I might need to navigate carefully. My mother had made her expectations abundantly clear before I departed. Lady Margaret Thornwell, daughter of the Earl of Somerset, would be present tonight. Her family possessed exactly the kind of wealth that could resolve our financial difficulties, and she had reportedly expressed interest in securing a titled husband. The arrangement made perfect sense from every practical standpoint, yet the thought filled me with a coldness that had nothing to do with the winter air outside. As I moved deeper into the ballroom, accepting greetings and engaging in the ritualistic dance of high society conversation, I felt the familiar weight of expectation settling on my shoulders like a heavy cloak. Every smile, every word, every gesture was scrutinized and interpreted by those around me. The Duke of Ravenhall was expected to be charming, confident, and above all, mindful of his duty to his family name. Then I saw her. She stood near the far wall, partially hidden behind a marble column, watching the festivities with an expression I couldn't immediately decipher. Unlike the other ladies present, she wore no elaborate jewelry, no feathers in her hair, no silk gown that cost more than most families earned in a year. Her dress was simple but elegant, a deep green that complemented her auburn hair, which was arranged in a style that was fashionable yet understated. But it was her face that stopped me in my tracks. Even from across the crowded ballroom, I could see the distinctive scar that ran along her left temple, a thin white line that somehow enhanced rather than marred her striking features. Her green eyes held an intelligence and depth that seemed to see beyond the superficial glitter of the evening's entertainment. There was something in her posture, in the way she held herself slightly apart from the crowd, that spoke of dignity maintained despite difficult circumstances. I found myself moving toward her without conscious decision, drawn by something I couldn't name. As I drew closer, I realized who she must be. The whispered conversations I had overheard, the barely concealed gossip that followed her wherever she appeared in polite society. This was Constance Fairweather, the illegitimate daughter of Count Pemberton himself. The stories surrounding her were numerous and contradictory, as such tales often are. Some claimed she worked as a governess, supporting herself through honest labor since her father had refused to acknowledge her publicly. Others whispered that she had been cast out entirely, surviving on the charity of distant relatives who barely tolerated her presence. What everyone agreed upon was that her mother had been a woman of questionable reputation, and that Constance bore the eternal mark of society's judgment for circumstances entirely beyond her control. As I approached, she seemed to sense my presence and turned toward me. Our eyes met across the remaining distance between us, and I felt something I had never experienced before. It was as if the crowded ballroom faded away, as if the music dimmed and the voices became distant echoes. Her gaze was direct, unafraid, and utterly without the calculated coquetry I had grown accustomed to in the marriage-minded daughters of nobility. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I was acutely aware that everyone in our vicinity had noticed my approach, that tongues would be wagging before the evening was half over. The Duke of Ravenhall showing interest in the illegitimate daughter of his family's greatest rival would provide gossip fodder for months to come. Yet I found I didn't care. She curtsied slightly, her movements graceful despite the obvious tension in her shoulders. When she spoke, her voice was clear and melodious, tinged with just a hint of wariness. "Your Grace," she said simply, neither overly deferential nor inappropriately familiar. I bowed formally, though something in her manner made me want to abandon such formalities entirely. "Miss Fairweather, I believe." I must confess, I had hoped for an introduction this evening. A slight smile played at the corners of her mouth, and I caught a glimpse of something that might have been amusement in her eyes. "Indeed? And what prompted such hope, if I may ask?" Her directness was refreshing after hours of coded conversation and veiled intentions. Here was someone who spoke plainly, without the layers of social artifice that usually surrounded every interaction in my world. I found myself answering with equal honesty. Curiosity, perhaps. Or maybe simply the desire for genuine conversation in a room full of practiced performances. "Where are you watching from tonight? I hope you're enjoying this tale of unexpected attraction and social scandal that's about to unfold." The orchestra struck up a waltz, and without fully considering the implications of my actions, I extended my hand toward her. "Would you honor me with this dance, Miss Fairweather?" The question hung in the air between us, and I watched as various emotions flickered across her expressive features. Surprise, certainly, but also something that looked like calculation. She was weighing the consequences, as any intelligent woman in her position would. To dance with me would mark her as the evening's most scandalous topic of conversation. To refuse would be a public slight that could have its own repercussions. She placed her gloved hand in mine, her touch sending an unexpected jolt through my entire being. "I would be honored, Your Grace, though I suspect we shall both regret this decision before the evening concludes." As we moved onto the dance floor, I became acutely aware of the whispers that followed in our wake. The crowd seemed to part before us, not out of respect but out of morbid fascination. I could feel dozens of eyes tracking our every movement, cataloguing each gesture for later dissection over tea and gossip sessions. Yet the moment we began to dance, the outside world seemed to fade once again. Constance moved with natural grace, her steps perfectly in time with mine despite the obvious tension radiating from those watching us. She held herself with remarkable composure, her spine straight and her chin lifted with quiet dignity. I found myself studying her face as we turned through the familiar patterns of the waltz. The scar that marked her temple told a story I suddenly wanted to know. It was not the result of some tragic accident of birth, but something more deliberate, more purposeful. There was a fineness to her features that spoke of good breeding, despite the circumstances of her birth, and an intelligence in her green eyes that suggested depths I had rarely encountered in the drawing rooms of my acquaintance. She broke the silence between us, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "You are causing quite a stir, Your Grace. I wonder if you have considered the cost of such public attention." I guided her through a turn, bringing us momentarily closer together. "I find myself caring less about public opinion than I perhaps should. Tell me, Miss Fairweather, what brings you to this particular gathering? Surely you must know that your presence here will be remarked upon extensively." A shadow passed across her features, and for a moment I glimpsed something vulnerable beneath her composed exterior. "I serve as governess to the Pemberton children," she said quietly. "Lady Pemberton occasionally requires my presence at such events to assist with the younger guests. I am here in a working capacity, nothing more." The revelation struck me with unexpected force. While I had heard rumors of her employment, hearing it confirmed so matter-of-factly brought home the reality of her situation. Here was a woman of obvious intelligence and refinement, reduced to serving the very family that should have acknowledged and protected her. The injustice of it filled me with an anger I hadn't anticipated. As the dance continued, I became increasingly aware of one particular pair of eyes tracking our movements with predatory intensity. Lord Roderick Ashworth stood near the refreshment table, his corpulent frame draped in expensive fabrics that couldn't disguise his cruel nature. At 45, he had already buried 2 wives and was known throughout society for his particular brand of malicious entertainment. He watched Constance with an expression that made my skin crawl, his small eyes glittering with something that was part avarice and part pure spite. I had heard rumors of Ashworth's interest in Constance, though the nature of that interest remained unclear. Some whispered that he sought to marry her for her connection to the Pemberton fortune, despite publicly disdaining her illegitimate status. Others suggested his intentions were far less honorable. Whatever his goals, the way he watched her now filled me with protective instincts I hadn't known I possessed. The waltz came to an end, and I reluctantly released her hand, though I found myself reluctant to return her to the sidelines where Ashworth waited like a spider in his web. Instead, I offered her my arm. Perhaps you would join me for some refreshment. The evening is still young, and I confess I find myself hoping to continue our conversation. She hesitated, glancing around the ballroom at the faces turned toward us with varying degrees of fascination, disapproval, and calculation. Your Grace, I fear that would be most unwise. Surely you understand the position such attention places me in. Before I could respond, a cold voice interrupted our exchange. Indeed, Miss Fairweather, one might wonder what aspirations drive such bold behavior. We turned to find Lord Ashworth approaching, his thin lips curved in what might charitably be called a smile. Everything about the man repulsed me, from his overpowdered face to the way his gaze lingered inappropriately on Constance's form. He moved with the confidence of a man who had never faced serious opposition to his will, and the calculating gleam in his eyes suggested he saw our interaction as somehow beneficial to his own schemes. Constance's entire demeanor changed in his presence. The composed woman who had danced with such grace moments before now seemed to shrink slightly, though she maintained her dignified posture. It was clear that Ashworth represented some form of threat to her, though the nature of that threat remained unclear. He bowed with exaggerated courtesy, his voice dripping with false solicitude. Your Grace, how generous of you to show such Christian charity toward the less fortunate members of our gathering. Miss Fairweather, I trust you are properly grateful for such unexpected attention from one so far above your station. The insult was delivered with such practiced smoothness that it would be difficult to call him out directly without appearing to overreact. Yet the venom beneath his words was unmistakable, and I felt my jaw clench with barely controlled anger. Constance responded with remarkable composure, her voice steady despite the obvious tension in her frame. Lord Ashworth, I am always grateful for any kindness shown to me, though I hope I never presume beyond my proper place. The exchange was a masterclass in social warfare, conducted with words as sharp as any blade. Ashworth was establishing dominance, reminding both Constance and myself of the social hierarchies that governed our world. Yet beneath his polished exterior, I sensed something desperate, something that spoke of a man whose position was perhaps not as secure as he pretended. I stepped closer to Constance, a gesture that was both protective and deliberately provocative. Lord Ashworth, I was not aware that you had appointed yourself guardian of social proprieties. How thoughtful of you to take such interest in the welfare of others. His eyes narrowed slightly, though his smile never wavered. Indeed, Your Grace, we all have responsibilities to maintain the proper order of things. Some responsibilities are inherited with title and position, while others arise from a simple desire to protect the innocent from unfortunate consequences. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Whatever game Ashworth was playing, Constance was clearly a key piece, and my interest in her had somehow complicated his plans. I found myself curious about those plans, though something told me the knowledge would bring nothing but trouble for all involved. The tension between us was interrupted by the announcement of supper, and the crowd began to move toward the dining hall. In the general shuffle of movement, Constance managed to slip away from both of us, disappearing into the throng with practiced skill. I watched her go with a mixture of admiration and frustration, knowing that she had deliberately removed herself from an increasingly dangerous situation. The following days passed in a haze of restless energy that I couldn't quite explain. The memory of Constance's green eyes and the way she had felt in my arms during that single waltz haunted my thoughts in ways that defied rational explanation. I found myself making excuses to ride past the village where I had learned she lived in modest lodgings, hoping for a glimpse of her auburn hair or the sound of her melodious voice. My mother, Lady Catherine Blackwood, had wasted no time in expressing her displeasure over my behavior at the Thornfield ball. She cornered me in the library 3 days after the event, her silver hair perfectly arranged and her blue eyes blazing with maternal determination. She settled into the chair across from my desk, her posture rigid with disapproval. Garrett, we need to discuss your inexplicable conduct at Lord Pemberton's gathering. Lady Margaret Thornwell was present, as we had discussed, yet you spent the entire evening creating scandal with that unfortunate girl. I set down my correspondence and met her gaze directly, though I felt the familiar weight of family obligation pressing down upon me. Mother, Miss Fairweather is hardly unfortunate. She is an intelligent, dignified woman who deserves better treatment than society has afforded her. Her expression grew even more severe, if such a thing were possible. She is illegitimate, Garrett. Her very existence is a reminder of moral failing, and associating with her publicly undermines everything your father worked to build. We need advantageous connections now more than ever. The reminder of our financial difficulties struck home as she had intended. My father's gambling debts and poor investments had left the ducal estate on the brink of bankruptcy. Only a marriage to someone of substantial wealth could preserve the family name and holdings. Lady Margaret represented exactly the solution our circumstances demanded, yet the thought of courting her filled me with profound emptiness. I attempted to redirect the conversation, though I knew it was futile. Perhaps there are other solutions to our difficulties that don't require sacrificing personal happiness entirely. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to the tone she had used when I was a child who needed correction. Personal happiness is a luxury we cannot afford, my dear son. Your duty is to your family, your tenants, and the hundreds of people who depend on the Blackwood name for their livelihoods. Romance is for poets and commoners, not for dukes with responsibilities. Despite her stern words, I found myself unable to dismiss the memory of dancing with Constance. The way she had spoken so directly, without the coquettish games that characterized most of my interactions with eligible young ladies, had been refreshing beyond measure. There had been something real about her, something authentic that I had rarely encountered in my privileged world. That evening, I made a decision that would have horrified my mother had she known of it. I rode out to the small cottage where Constance lodged with an elderly widow, ostensibly to deliver some books that I claimed were needed for the Pemberton children's education. It was a transparent excuse, but it would provide plausible justification for our meeting should anyone question it later. The cottage sat at the edge of a small wood, its windows glowing warmly against the gathering December dusk. Snow had begun to fall again, dusting the bare branches of the oak trees that surrounded the modest dwelling. I tied my horse to the garden gate and approached the front door with my heart beating faster than seemed entirely reasonable. Constance herself answered my knock, and the surprise that flickered across her features was quickly replaced by something that might have been pleasure, though she attempted to conceal it. She wore a simple wool dress in deep blue, and her hair was arranged more casually than it had been at the ball. The effect was even more striking than her formal appearance had been. She curtsied slightly, though there was something in her manner that suggested the gesture was more habitual than heartfelt. Your Grace, this is most unexpected. Is there something you require regarding the children's lessons? I held up the leather satchel containing the books I had brought as my excuse for visiting. I thought these volumes might prove useful for their studies in history and literature. I hoped I might discuss their educational progress with you. She stepped aside to allow me entry, though I could see the conflicted emotions playing across her expressive face. The interior of the cottage was small but immaculately maintained, with a fire crackling cheerfully in the stone hearth and the scent of baking bread filling the air. Everything spoke of modest comfort maintained through careful attention and hard work. Mrs. Whitmore, the elderly widow who owned the cottage, emerged from the kitchen with flour on her apron and curiosity written plainly on her weathered features. Constance made the introductions with perfect propriety, though I could sense the tension underlying her composed manner. The older woman bobbed a curtsy, her eyes bright with interest. Your Grace, what an honor to have you in our humble home. Constance, dear, perhaps His Grace would appreciate some tea after his ride. I accepted the offer gratefully, and soon found myself seated in the cottage's tiny parlor while Constance prepared refreshments with graceful efficiency. The domesticity of the scene struck me as profoundly peaceful after the elaborate formality that characterized most of my daily interactions. When we were finally alone, Constance took the chair across from mine, her hands folded carefully in her lap. The firelight played across her features, softening the lines of care that I was beginning to recognize around her eyes. She spoke quietly, her voice carrying a note of caution that hadn't been present during our dance. She looked at me directly, her green eyes serious and searching. Your Grace, I must ask why you have really come here. Surely the education of the Pemberton children could be discussed through more conventional channels. Her directness was both refreshing and unsettling. I found myself reluctant to examine my own motives too closely, yet her question demanded honesty. I wanted to see you again, I admitted, the words surprising me with their simplicity. Our conversation at the ball was far too brief, and I found myself hoping for another opportunity to speak with someone who seems refreshingly genuine. A flush colored her cheeks, though whether from pleasure or embarrassment I couldn't determine. Sir, I fear you don't fully understand the position such attention places me in. I survive on the charity of others and the small income my work provides. I cannot afford the luxury of scandal or impropriety. The reminder of her precarious circumstances struck me forcefully. While I struggled with financial difficulties that threatened my family's status, she faced the constant possibility of complete destitution. One word of gossip in the wrong ear could cost her the employment that stood between her and poverty. I leaned forward, suddenly urgent to make her understand something I was only beginning to understand myself. "Miss Fairweather, I would never do anything to jeopardize your situation. But surely there is nothing improper in two people having an honest conversation." She smiled then, though there was something sad in the expression. "Your Grace, you speak like someone who has never lived at the mercy of others' opinions. For someone in my position, even the appearance of impropriety can be devastating." Before I could respond, the sound of hooves on the cottage path reached our ears. Constance immediately tensed, moving to the window to peer through the curtains. What she saw there drained the color from her face entirely. She turned back to me, her voice urgent and low. "Lord Ashworth approaches. You must leave immediately, or we shall both face consequences neither of us can afford. Please hit that like button if you're enjoying this tale of forbidden attraction and the dangerous games of high society." The panic in Constance's voice galvanized me into action, though every instinct rebelled against the idea of fleeing like a guilty schoolboy. Yet I could see the genuine fear in her eyes, and whatever threat Ashworth represented to her was clearly more serious than mere social embarrassment. I gathered the books I had brought and moved quickly toward the cottage's rear entrance, pausing only to press her hand briefly in what I hoped was a reassuring manner. Her fingers trembled slightly in mine, and she whispered urgently, "There is a path through the wood that leads to the main road. Please, Your Grace, go quickly." I slipped out through the kitchen door just as Ashworth's heavy knock echoed through the cottage. The falling snow provided cover as I made my way through the bare trees, though I found myself consumed with rage at being forced to skulk through the darkness while that odious man threatened someone under my protection. The thought stopped me cold. When had I begun to think of Constance as being under my protection? From my concealed position among the oak trees, I could hear voices from within the cottage, though the words were indistinct. Ashworth's tone was clearly aggressive, while Constance's responses remained admirably composed despite whatever pressure he was applying. The conversation lasted nearly a quarter-hour before I heard his horse departing, and only then did I dare to breathe freely again. The following weeks brought a series of carefully orchestrated encounters that allowed me to learn more about the remarkable woman who had so thoroughly captured my attention. I discovered that she had educated herself through voracious reading, that she spoke French and Italian with fluency that rivaled my Oxford education, and that her knowledge of literature and philosophy far exceeded that of most ladies of my acquaintance. More importantly, I learned the story behind the scar that marked her temple. She had been 13 when a runaway carriage threatened to strike a small child in the village square. Without hesitation, she had thrown herself forward to push the child to safety, taking the full impact of the carriage wheel against her own head. The injury had nearly killed her, and the resulting scar had marked her as different in a society that prized physical perfection above moral courage. The revelation only deepened my admiration for her character. Here was a woman who had risked her life for a stranger's child, yet society branded her as unworthy because of the circumstances of her birth. The injustice of it filled me with a burning anger that I struggled to contain during my daily interactions with the very people who perpetuated such cruel judgments. Our meetings became more frequent and more treasured as the winter deepened. We would encounter each other seemingly by chance in the village lending library, or I would happen upon her walking the children through the snow-covered fields that surrounded the Pemberton estate. Each conversation revealed new depths to her intelligence and character, and I found myself falling deeper into an emotional entanglement that I knew could only lead to heartbreak for us both. It was during one of these walks, as we followed a frost-covered path through a grove of ancient yew trees, that she finally shared the full scope of her precarious situation. The bare branches overhead created intricate patterns against the gray December sky, and our breath formed clouds in the cold air as we walked at a careful distance that would satisfy the proprieties should anyone observe us. She stopped beside a low stone wall that bordered the estate, her gloved hands resting on the frost-covered stones as she gathered her courage to speak. "Your Grace, I fear I must be completely honest with you about the nature of Lord Ashworth's interest in my circumstances." I moved closer, though still maintaining the appearance of casual conversation should we be observed. "Please, tell me what troubles you. Perhaps I can be of assistance." She turned to face me, her green eyes reflecting a pain that went far deeper than mere social embarrassment. "He has proposed marriage, though his intentions are far from honorable. He believes that my connection to the Pemberton family, however illegitimate, could prove financially advantageous." More disturbing still, he seems to take pleasure in the idea of possessing someone who would have no recourse should he choose to treat her cruelly. The revelation struck me like a physical blow. The thought of that repulsive man having any claim over Constance filled me with a protective rage that surprised me with its intensity. "Surely you refused his proposal?" A bitter smile crossed her features, and for a moment I glimpsed the full weight of the burden she carried. "Your Grace, you speak as though I have choices that someone in my position simply does not possess. Lord Ashworth has made it clear that my continued employment with the Pemberton family depends upon my favorable consideration of his suit. Without that income, I have no means of survival." The calculated cruelty of Ashworth's trap was breathtaking in its completeness. He had positioned himself to force her compliance through economic coercion, knowing that her illegitimate status left her without family protection or social recourse. It was exactly the sort of predatory behavior I had learned to expect from him, yet hearing it applied to Constance filled me with murderous fury. I struggled to keep my voice level, though my hands clenched into fists at my sides. There must be alternatives. Surely other families would value a governess of your obvious qualifications. She shook her head sadly, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. My reputation is already damaged by my birth circumstances. Should word spread that I had been dismissed from the Pemberton household for any reason, no respectable family would consider employing me. Lord Ashworth has been quite thorough in his planning. As we stood there in the gathering dusk, with snow beginning to fall again through the bare branches above us, I found myself making promises that I had no clear means of keeping. The sight of her distress, the knowledge of the trap that had been laid for her, and my own growing feelings combined to override every consideration of duty and practicality that had governed my life until that moment. I took her hand in mine, knowing that the gesture crossed every boundary of propriety but unable to restrain myself. "Constance, I will not allow this to happen. Whatever Lord Ashworth schemes, he will not succeed in forcing you into a marriage that would destroy your happiness." She looked up at me with an expression that combined hope and despair in equal measure. "Your Grace, I am touched by your concern, but what can you possibly do? You have your own obligations, your own family's needs to consider. I would never ask you to sacrifice your future for mine." The reminder of my mother's expectations and our family's financial difficulties struck home with painful clarity. Lady Margaret Thornwell represented security and social acceptability, everything that a rational man in my position should desire. Yet standing there with Constance's hand in mine, feeling the warmth of her trust despite her desperate circumstances, I found myself questioning every assumption that had guided my life. If you're enjoying this story of love against impossible odds, make sure to subscribe for more tales of romance and redemption. The winter wind seemed to carry the weight of all our unspoken feelings as we stood there at the crossroads of duty and desire, neither of us yet knowing how high the price of our growing attachment would ultimately prove to be. The sound of approaching horses broke the spell between us, and we quickly separated, returning to the careful distance that propriety demanded. Yet as we walked back toward the main house, I could feel something fundamental shifting within me. Whatever the cost, I could not stand by and watch Constance be sacrificed to Ashworth's cruel ambitions. The crisis came, as such things often do, with shocking suddenness on a bitter January morning. I received an urgent message from Mrs. Whitmore that Constance had collapsed during her lessons with the Pemberton children and been confined to her bed with what the local physician feared might be pneumonia. The cottage was freezing, the elderly widow explained, as they could no longer afford sufficient fuel for the fires. I rode through the snow-covered countryside with my heart hammering against my ribs, arriving at the cottage to find Constance pale and shivering beneath inadequate blankets. Her usually bright eyes were dulled with fever, and her breathing came in labored gasps that terrified me more than any battlefield injury I had witnessed during my brief military service. Mrs. Whitmore met me at the door, her weathered face creased with worry. "Oh, Your Grace, thank heaven you've come. She's been asking for you in her delirium, though she doesn't know what she's saying, poor dear." I knelt beside her narrow bed, taking her burning hand in mine while fighting back the overwhelming fear that I might lose her before I had found the courage to tell her what she had come to mean to me. As I sat there through the long hours of that terrible night, watching her struggle for each breath, I finally understood the true nature of love. It was not the calculated arrangement my mother had planned with Lady Margaret, nor the passionate but fleeting attraction celebrated in poetry. It was this bone-deep terror at the thought of existing in a world that no longer contained her laughter, her intelligence, her unexpected moments of joy despite all the hardships life had imposed upon her. When the fever finally broke 3 days later, I was still there, unshaven and exhausted but filled with gratitude that brought tears to my eyes. Constance opened her eyes to find me holding her hand, and for a moment confusion flickered across her features before recognition dawned. Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from her illness. "Garrett? You shouldn't be here. If anyone should see you." The sound of my given name on her lips sent warmth through me that had nothing to do with the fire I had been tending in her tiny grate. "Let them see," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "I'm not leaving you to face this alone." It was then that Mrs. Whitmore brought word that Lord Ashworth had been spreading rumors throughout the county about our supposed improper relationship. He claimed to have witnessed compromising encounters between us, painting Constance as a scheming fortune hunter who had set her cap at ensnaring a duke through deliberate seduction. The lies were precisely calculated to destroy what remained of her reputation while positioning himself as her only possible salvation through marriage. As Constance slowly regained her strength over the following weeks, I made a discovery that changed everything. While researching legal remedies for Ashworth's slander, I uncovered evidence of his own criminal activities. The man who positioned himself as a moral authority had been systematically embezzling funds from charity organizations, forging documents to hide his gambling debts, and using his position to coerce vulnerable women into compromising situations. More shocking still was the revelation I uncovered about Constance's true parentage. Hidden among the Pemberton family documents was proof that her mother had been secretly married to Count Pemberton before his arranged marriage to his current wife. The ceremony had been conducted in Scotland, making it legally binding despite the family's later attempts to suppress all record of it. Constance was not illegitimate at all, but the rightful heir to significant portions of the Pemberton estate. The confrontation with Ashworth took place in the library of Thornfield Manor, where I had requested a private meeting under the pretense of discussing a business proposition. When I presented him with the evidence of his crimes and the proof of Constance's legitimate birth, his carefully maintained facade crumbled entirely. His face contorted with rage and desperation as he realized the complete collapse of his schemes. "You have no idea what you're interfering with, Blackwood. That woman is nothing, regardless of what papers you may have found. Society will never accept her, and you'll destroy yourself trying to elevate her." I stood from behind the desk where I had laid out the damning documents, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "On the contrary, Lord Ashworth, I believe society will be very interested to learn the truth about both Miss Pemberton's heritage and your own activities. The choice is yours whether this information becomes public gradually or all at once." The threat was clear, and Ashworth was intelligent enough to recognize that his position had become untenable. Within a week, he had quietly withdrawn from the county, claiming urgent business in Scotland that would require his extended absence. The rumors he had spread about Constance began to lose their power as whispers of his own disgrace took their place. Count Pemberton's reaction to learning the truth about his daughter's legitimacy was perhaps the most surprising development of all. Rather than rage or denial, he showed what appeared to be genuine relief at finally being able to acknowledge her publicly. The weight of the secret he had carried for more than 2 decades had clearly taken its toll, and the opportunity to make amends seemed to transform him entirely. The public acknowledgement of Constance's true status changed everything, yet the moment I treasured most was private and simple. On a warm February evening, as the first hints of spring began to show in the lengthening days, I found her in the conservatory at Thornfield Manor, tending to the early flowers that had begun to bloom despite the lingering winter cold. She looked up as I approached, her face radiant with the happiness that had gradually replaced the careful wariness I had grown accustomed to seeing in her eyes. The scar at her temple caught the golden light of the setting sun, and I found myself thinking that it made her even more beautiful, a permanent reminder of the courage and selflessness that defined her character. I took her hands in mine, no longer caring who might observe us or what society might think. "Constance, these past months have taught me that duty without love is merely obligation, while love without courage is simply cowardice. I love you with everything I am, and I'm asking you to marry me not because it's expected or advantageous, but because I cannot imagine a life worth living without you in it." Her answer came not in words but in the way she stepped into my arms, her face lifted toward mine with complete trust and joy. When our lips finally met, it was with the sweetness of love that had been tested by adversity and emerged stronger for the trials it had endured. Our wedding that spring was a celebration that brought together former enemies and longtime friends, a testament to the power of love to heal old wounds and create new possibilities. As I watched my bride walking toward me through the flower-strewn aisle of the village church, her face glowing with happiness beneath her mother's wedding veil, I understood that true nobility had nothing to do with birth or title and everything to do with the choices we make when tested by life's challenges. The lesson I learned through loving Constance was simple yet profound. Courage is not the absence of fear but the decision to act rightly despite that fear. Love is not a luxury for those with the freedom to choose, but a necessity for anyone who hopes to live a life of meaning and purpose. Most importantly, the opinions of society matter far less than the approval of our own conscience and the person who sees us most clearly. If this story of love triumphing over social prejudice and personal adversity has touched your heart, please subscribe to hear more tales of romance, redemption, and the enduring power of choosing love over fear. Sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with grand gestures but with the simple courage to see past society's expectations to the truth of another person's heart.